Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Dockett, Psychotherapy Networker's Senior Editor. And here with me today, I am thrilled to have Dr. Valeria Chuba. Valeria is a clinical sexologist and a sex and intimacy expert. And she is also the host of a rather popular podcast called Get Sex Smart, which I encourage everybody to check out. It's a lot of fun. As soon as you're finished watching this video would be a good time, actually, to check it out. Thank you, Valeria, for being with us.
Thank you, Laura. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I wanted Valeria to join us today because she features rather large in the cover story for the May issue of the magazine, which is all about men and MeToo. So we were very curious about the reactions that men are having to what is a fairly radical cultural shift. And we wanted to know what their deeper feelings were about the MeToo movement, feelings that they probably weren't sharing publicly, that they may or may not have been sharing even with their partners or other intimates, but perhaps they were talking about in therapy. And Valeria, you had some great insights into this, and I think it's partly because of the nature of the work that you do. You have a lot of men in your practice, and you talk about fairly intimate things all the time. So let's just start by talking about the men that you see, why they're coming in to see you, how you're helping them.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Yes, so the men that I see, oftentimes the ages are between about 30 to 60. That's kind of the most common age range. And the concerns really range from what you would think of a typical concern, like erection or ejaculation issues. But interestingly enough, not as many. A lot of the men that I talk to, they specifically struggle with those who are partnered with a woman. They struggle with discrepancies in different levels of sexual desire in a relationship. A lot of men, all of them really, everybody that I talk to, struggle very much with performance anxiety and performance pressure. Another huge part of this for me is, and for the work that I do, it's men coming in with sexual desires or fantasies and really having a hard time communicating their truth. The truth of their sexuality, the fullness of their sexuality to their female partners. And that's really, that last one is present in every single male client that I work with.
So with all of that at stake for them, it seems to me like Me Too might be a little bit concerning. Tell me what they're talking to you about in terms of Me Too.
Yeah, well, and I will say this right off the bat, that the men that come to me, there is a level of openness to that kind of discussion that exists. And I realize that not every therapist out there or every healer out there will have the same level of openness from their male client. And the men who come to me, they're there to solve their sexual concerns and their intimate concerns. And so one that's very common is they just can't believe. They just can't believe that it exists. Or if they can believe that it exists, they cannot believe the degree, the depth, and the breadth, and the horror of it, and how pervasive it is. And what they really struggle with is the fact that it's a part of women's, I won't generalize, but I think a lot of women's everyday existence. Some of them have a much easier time dealing with something like the Weinstein story. I mean, it was shocking at first, but I think because it's such a monstrous example, to a lot of them it's easier to separate from it because, well, I'm not that guy. I would never do anything like that. But since, and can you believe it's only been 6 months? Right? So it's like we live in a different world. And so since the Weinstein story, though, there have been a lot of other stories, both public stories and personal stories that are a lot more nuanced, that are a lot more complex. And I'm seeing men reacting to those stories with a much higher degree of defensiveness, with a need to minimize or with the need to kind of remove themselves from it. And the way I like to describe it is nobody wants to be a villain in their own life story.
Oh, yes, right.
Right? And the men that I talk to, they often seek reassurance from me. Even before Me Too, I was hearing this all the time. Is this weird? Am I gross? And this the language that they use. Am I out of control? Is this inappropriate? Tell me if it's inappropriate. I don't want to be a sicko. It's so much, self. It's very negative, very self-negative talk.
So let's talk about this for a second more. So I feel like we're really seeing, when we see these examples of Weinstein and the others, there is this assumption, I think, that comes to the fore that for a lot of men, assaultive and harassing behavior can be the norm. But the truth is, for a lot of men, it's not the norm. And there is something inherently damaging about the idea that men's sexuality is somehow inherently wrong. So let's talk about that message and why it's dangerous.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's incredibly important. So, I mean, first of all, I'm a sex positive professional. So to me, and I think to all of us in society, ideally, this is how we should view human sexuality. It is a spectrum of desires and behaviors, and it's healthy. It's normal, right? Regardless of gender or sexual orientation. So there are a lot of damaging messages that we as a society receive and promote about both male and female sexuality. They're equally damaging, just in different ways. And so just as female sexuality is not inherently passive or restricted or deficient in some way, right, nor is male sexuality inherently violent. And I think what's incredibly important is to make that distinction between what is inherent or biological and what is taught to men by society from a very young age. And unfortunately, in that sense, sexuality is very much connected to masculinity, to how men are encouraged to use sex as a way to assert themselves, as a way to seek validation, as a way to seek dominance in their social circle. And unfortunately, those are the messages that they get around about women. Using women as a way to assert themselves. We have trouble because we don't teach children about boundaries or consent. We don't teach kids about body autonomy, right? So if you combine those two, it becomes incredibly tragic. And of course, we don't teach children sex positive, pleasure focused sex education. Nice. So there's a whole host of misinformation that men receive there, just like women do. Yeah. And one thing that I do want to say, though, so again, we always need to remember that is the backdrop that we're working with. Men don't spring up from the earth wanting to assault women, right? And we need to take responsibility as a society for the way we bring men up, just like we bring all of our kids up, right? Yeah. And so that's one piece. And the second piece that I really want to drive home, because we always need to, I think, keep in mind the ultimate goal of MeToo, which I think is liberating and amplifying victims' voices, creating societal change, profound change, but also I think ultimately creating a society where people of all genders can interact in a positive way, including sex. And so one moment that I think is very important to note here is that just like for a lot of women, again, I hate to generalize, but I think for a lot of women, Me Too is a part of their life story, right? It's not just some one moment. For a lot of women, it's part of a lot of small and big moments that happen to us through our lifetimes that can be categorized as Me Too, right? And it really informs our story. It informs certainly the way we view our sexuality and the way we act as sexual beings in the world. So for men, sexual shame, profound, pervasive, deep sexual shame is a part of their story. Because like I mentioned before, male sexuality is used to control men in certain ways, to demand things from men, to pressure them to perform in a certain way. And by the way, that performance pressure is what they carry with them throughout their lifetimes, and they certainly bring it into the bedroom a lot. And so if we want to talk to men, if we want to connect to men, we need to understand and that their story is oftentimes informed by struggles with sexual shame and many instances where they felt that their sexuality was out of bounds, perverted, gross, you name it, right? I mentioned the languaging that exists around it, right? And so where I think my job gives me this wonderful advantage is because both my training and both the way that I work with men is very much based on creating a safe space. and really removing shame from the conversation and creating a space that is accepting of them, whoever they are, wherever they are in this moment, right? And so I think that creates then an opportunity to have a conversation. When they feel like they won't get shamed, they won't get rejected or judged, they become a lot more open to acknowledging some very difficult truths. But when you tell a man that there's something wrong with him, that he's dirty or gross or just because he's a man, it creates an immediate defensive reaction. And unfortunately, it's not productive, right? So that's something I really wanted to draw attention to today.
So I appreciate that. And I also, it's funny to think about, we talked a little bit about how despite the way the MeToo movement may be exacerbating these feelings of shame, you really think it could be a net positive for men and for couples, especially. So let's talk a little bit about how these concepts that are sort of now floating around via MeToo can be helpful in a relationship for both.
Absolutely.
For both parties,
Well, MeToo it's a call. It's a call to action. It's a call for men specifically to step up and step into a way of being that's very different. I cannot recall a moment in history where men were specifically called in to step into the very parts of themselves that they have been taught by society to deny or shame themselves for, like emotional intelligence, like empathy, like compassion. And so we need to acknowledge again that men are facing this dilemma and this difficult choice right now. And because men are so taught by society that failure is not an option, you can imagine what it feels like to be then asked to use the very skills that you were never encouraged or taught how to use. So there's a challenge there that I think we all need to face and understand. And I think that ultimately what's really wonderful about the promise of how MeToo is going to shift this conversation is that very fact, is that a lot of men are really being pushed, whether they like it or not, to learn those skills, even if it's uncomfortable. And it's pretty bitter medicine for a lot of men, I have to admit. But what it then leads to, this socialization of men it's at the very core of a lot of sexual issues and sexual frustrations that especially men and women in heterosexual relationships face. This difficulty with empathy, this difficulty with emotional space, this focus on performance versus focus on pleasure and connection with your partner. These are at the very root of almost every issue I see in my practice. So men stepping into MeToo and saying, I know this is difficult for me, but I'm going to try and understand, it creates a connection with our partners. Because another truth, unfortunate truth, is that men and women, we don't know who we're sleeping with. We really don't, oftentimes. We're not sharing our truths with each other, especially when it comes to our sexuality, our desires, our fantasies, again, because there's so much shame around it. So, connecting with your partner and learning the skills to create a safe space for her to evolve and to open up, because that's what women really need. Women need to feel like they're safe with men, right? Because I always talk about this. Women in society often don't feel safe around men. So imagine then we go home and we build a life and we have sex with men. And so how does that, do you know what I mean? How does that connect then? Right? So being a safe space for a woman that you're with and holding space for her, whatever that is, her emotional expression, her physical expression, that's what women crave from men. It's that time and space and that patience and understanding. I see you. And I acknowledge how difficult it's been for you. So honestly, this can be so wonderful and so transformative. But like any transformation, it comes with a certain price. And that price is humility. And that price is letting go of defenses. And that price is vulnerability and the desire to open up and learn. Okay. And I think there are men, not all men, but I think there are enough men out there who are sort of ready for that. Yeah. That I think we should call them in at this stage.
Yeah. So this dovetails very nicely with my next question, which is the question of consent, which now feels like it's writ large in the culture again. Yes. But it's part of your practice and your knowledge base, and I know for sex therapists, they really know their way around this issue. The general public might think of it as a little bit obnoxious. So we don't want that. We don't want to have to work on consent. That's gonna steal all the passion out of our sexual exchanges. You say, in fact, that consent, you called it in the article, the holy grail of sex. You think it helps improve people's sex lives. Let's talk a little bit about why that is.
Yes, it's one of the biggest misconceptions that people have, that consent is boring, that having, to discuss things, and obtain consent when it comes to sex is going to break the mood. It's ridiculous, honestly. Yeah. It's not. In fact, consent is incredibly sexy. Because if you think about this, what makes sex good for people? Knowing where you are, knowing who you're with, understanding what that person's yes and no are, understanding what the boundaries are. Consent is knowing the rules, right? And everything is better when you know the rules. You can win at the game if you know the rules. If you don't, it becomes a lot more difficult. And it creates space for both people. It creates space for, again, if we're talking about heterosexual dynamics, oftentimes for women to know that their no will be respected, knowing that there's respect for their bodies and their needs and desires. For men, there's a lot less guessing. Am I being the bad guy? Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? And weaving consent also promotes communication. And if there's one thing that we all need that's at the core of, forget everything else, if there's one thing you need to practice and learn when it comes to sex, it's communication. Because when you have consent, then you know how to talk about not just what you don't want, but what you want. Consent and pleasure go hand in hand. Saying no to something is just as important as being able to say yes to something. And again, talking from the male perspective, what I hear from men a lot is, I want to know that I'm doing a good job. I want to know that the woman I'm with is having a good time. I want to know that I'm satisfying her as a lover. Well, that's how you know. You don't have to wonder, because when you have consent and you have communication, you have that flow of information. A woman will feed back to you what is working and what's not, and she will encourage you in a positive way to offer her things that will work. And it will feed back to you a sense of confidence, a sense of accomplishment even, why not? So it's very much this organic process. And it really, like I said, it really creates a feeling of safety, a feeling like, I can express the fullness of who I am. It is as important to men as it is for women. I mentioned earlier that so many men are restricted by shame. They have a hard time expressing what they really want because they've been taught it's bad or gross. And so consent is there for everybody. And when I talk about sex education, it's not just about preventing STIs and unwanted pregnancy. It's very much about body autonomy. It's very much about boundaries, consent, ongoing and enthusiastic consent, and always pleasure. Then they cannot be and should never be separated because they depend on each other, if that makes sense.
That does. It's an enlightening perspective to have on it. So finally, let's just talk, and you brought it up a little bit, about how men and women don't always understand each other's experiences, don't always understand each other's sexuality, even when they're having sex, even when they've been having sex for years. So let's talk a little bit about the reality of female sexuality that you think men sometimes miss, and that you sort of help guide them through. I know when we talked earlier for the article, you said you feel like part of your job is really translating woman into man. So let's talk a little bit about what happens in that translation, kinds of things you try to teach them.
Yeah, I feel like a bridge of sorts sometimes, kind of bridging back and forth. I think that, again, before I move on to female sexuality specifically, I again want to set the scene and remind everybody just how much of what we're taught about female and male relationships is focused on what separates us and divides us. You know, that whole Mars versus Venus theory. And when we talk about relationships and specifically sex in those terms, what we're doing is we're engaging in a very fun game of confirmation bias. It certainly sounds great, and we nod along and we laugh, but then there's no positive outcome. It doesn't actually do anything to connect us. So when I work with my clients, I always help them identify ways in which they can connect, ways in which they can empathize with each other, and using those points as points to begin the conversation and the healing process. And when it comes to female sexuality, again, we need to understand and acknowledge that as a society, we have been controlling and minimizing and telling lies, outrageous lies about female sexuality. We have been punishing female sexuality. We restrict women for being too sexual. We punish women. We have plenty of words for women who are too sexual. And now, because of, we see so much in the media stories about low sexual desire and women don't want to have sex. And by the way, men also experiencing low sexual desire too, oftentimes. But the story that a woman being, not desirous of sex enough. So as a woman, you often feel like you cannot win, right? No matter what you do, you cannot win. And so that's part of the conversation, and that's what men hear. I think a lot of men assume that women are by nature a lot more restricted than they really are, when in fact, one of the things that restricts women is slut shaming. It's the fear that if I tell my partner that that's what I want, he's going to shame me or judge me, which is very ironic because men are a lot more open-minded about their partner's sexuality that you might think. That's actually a huge advantage, I think, when you work with men, is they often, again, I'm not generalizing, but oftentimes they are a lot more interested and curious about sexual expression, especially if it might involve them in some way. So there's a degree of openness. But when men don't understand, that's their perspective. And so what they don't understand is just the level of restriction that women face and the level of shame as well that women carry about sexuality, about specifically their bodies, about being too much. Right? And also, of course, for men, it's, frankly, this is just lack of basic sex education, not understanding female anatomy. Our society centers, when we talk about heterosexual sex, we center male sexuality very much. We center the erection. We talk about performance, when in fact, that's not what creates pleasure and sexual satisfaction for women. So, right? So, understanding how sex works for women, how often female desire may be responsive, right? And so that's somewhat different from how men often experience desire. And so really understanding the nuances and understanding that not using male sexuality as the standard for all sexuality. I think that that's incredibly important. And female sexuality have a lot to teach us. It's incredibly powerful and rich.
Yeah. Well, Valeria, thank you so much. This has been really enlightening. And again, I recommend viewers to check out your podcast. They can also find you online at Ask Dr. Valeria. Is that your website?
Yes, so Ask Dr. Valeria is my handle on Twitter. My website is drvaleriachuba.com. My podcast is Get Sex Smart on iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, so I'm all over the place.
And you can also find
You're welcome to find me.
Yeah, you can find her writ large in the May issue of the magazine. The cover story is Men and Me Too. What are they thinking? Thank you so much, Valeria.
It's my pleasure, Lauren. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.